The wind in this part of New Mexico had a voice. It was not the gentle whisper that rustled cottonwood leaves by a river. It was a dry, rasping thing that scraped across the plains, carrying dust and the ghosts of forgotten promises. It was the only steady companion Clara Dawson had known for 2 years, ever since she buried her husband, Elias, on the small rise behind the cabin. Her ranch was a testament to stubbornness. The house, built of sun-baked adobe and weathered timber, sagged like a tired old man. The barn leaned just enough to make a person nervous, and the fences were a patchwork of new wood and old, a history of repairs that marked the passing seasons. The land itself was the greatest adversary. It was a hard, unforgiving expanse of cracked earth and thirsty scrub brush that stretched to a horizon shimmering with heat. The creek that gave the nearby town its name, Dry Creek, was little more than a dusty scar in the landscape for most of the year, a cruel joke played by whatever god had carved out this territory. 2 years, 730 days of waking before the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and pale orange. 730 nights of listening to the coyotes yip and howl, their lonesome calls echoing her own hollowed-out heart. Elias was gone. The Comanche raid that had taken him had also stolen their son, little Thomas, and with them, any softness that had ever existed in Clara. What remained was a woman forged in silence and labor, as tough and unyielding as the land she refused to abandon. The townsfolk in Dry Creek had their opinions. They were whispered over dry goods at the mercantile and spoken more loudly over whiskey at the saloon. Cursed, some said. That land took her man, and now it is taking her soul. Others, mostly the women who gathered by the church, pitied her with a sharp-edged condescension. Too proud, they would murmur behind their hands. A woman is not meant to be alone. She should have sold the ranch and found another husband by now. It is not natural. Clara knew what they said. She felt it in their averted eyes when she rode into town, in the way their conversations would halt and then restart in lower tones as she passed. They saw a widow who worked like a man, and it unsettled them. Her hands were not the soft, flour-dusted hands of a baker's wife. They were calloused and cracked. Her knuckles often scraped raw from mending a fence post or wrestling with a stubborn piece of machinery. Her face, framed by dark hair she kept tied back in a severe knot, was browned by the sun, with fine lines etched around her eyes from squinting into the relentless glare. She was 28 years old but felt ancient, carved from the same stone as the mesas that loomed in the distance. Her days fell into a rhythm of survival. Before dawn, she would be in the barn, milking her 2 bony cows, their hides stretched tight over their ribs. She would scatter feed for the chickens, their frantic clucking a brief burst of life in the morning stillness. Then came the fences. There was always a fence to mend, a post to replace, a wire to tighten against the lean bodies of coyotes or the possibility of stray cattle. She worked with a methodical, silent fury, her movements economical and sure. She did not have the brute strength of a man, so she had learned to use leverage, patience, and a deep-seated refusal to fail. She ate her meals standing up in the kitchen, usually just a piece of hard bread and jerky, her eyes scanning the horizon through the grimy window pane. She was always watching, always listening. The rifle Elias had taught her to use was never far from her side. During the day, it leaned against the wall of whatever structure she was working near. At night, it lay on the empty pillow beside her in the cold bed. Its smooth, cool stock, a comfort of a kind. The nights were the hardest. The silence in the small cabin was a living thing, so profound it seemed to press in on her, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. In those long, dark hours, the memories would come for her, sharp and cruel as broken glass. The smell of smoke, the sound of screams, the sight of Elias falling, the terrible, empty space where Thomas's small hand should have been in hers. She would lie rigid in the dark, her knuckles white on the rifle, and wait for the dawn to come and burn the ghosts away. The gossip in town swirled around the circumstances of Elias's death. The official story, The one Sheriff Brody reluctantly accepted was the raid. But in the smoky confines of the Golden Spur Saloon, other versions took shape, growing more elaborate with each shot of whiskey poured. The prevailing tale was that Elias had died defending her honor. They said a cattle baron's son, a man named Jebediah Kane, had made an indecent advance, and Elias had stepped in. The Kanes were powerful, with enough land and men to make a problem like a homesteader disappear. The raid, the gossip suggested, had been no random act of violence, but a convenient cover. This story cast Clara in a strange light. To some men, she was a tragic figure, the object of a fatal devotion. They would watch her pass with a kind of sorrowful respect. But to others, she was a source of dark amusement or a challenge. Her independence was an affront to them. They would slouch against the saloon's porch posts as she rode by, their gazes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. They saw a woman who had gotten a man killed and now had the audacity to survive without one. Their mockery was a low, constant hum, another of the harsh elements she had to endure. A few, the quiet ones who worked their own small plots of land, felt a secret envy. They saw in her a strength they were not sure they possessed, a refusal to break that they could only admire from a distance. One sweltering afternoon in late August, Clara guided her old buckboard wagon down the single dusty street of Dry Creek. The list of supplies she needed was short, but her reserves were shorter. The corn crop had failed again. The stalks withered and yellow before they had a chance to ear. The small vegetable patch she tended with fierce determination had yielded little more than a handful of stringy beans and pale, stunted potatoes. She needed flour, salt, and coffee, necessities that felt like luxuries. She tied the reins of her old mare, Bess, to the hitching post in front of the mercantile. As she stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, the sound of rough laughter drifted from the alleyway between the store and the saloon. She recognized the voices of some of the hands from the Kane ranch. "I tell you, she is drier than a dead man's bones." One man cackled. "Been 2 years. A woman like that needs a man to plow her fields, if you take my meaning." A chorus of crude laughter followed. Clara froze, her hand on the mercantile's door. Her first instinct was to turn, to confront them, to let the cold fury that lived inside her lash out. But she knew the futility of it. It would only make things worse, confirm their vision of her as a wild, unmanageable woman. It would be a moment of satisfaction followed by weeks of heightened scorn. So she did what she always did. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and pushed the door open, the little bell above it announcing her arrival with a cheerful, mocking jingle. Inside, Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, gave her a pitying look that was almost worse than the men's derision. He knew she had heard. Everyone in Dry Creek heard everything. She ignored him, her voice flat and businesslike as she recited her list. She paid with the few coins she had, her purse feeling unnervingly light. As she carried the heavy sack of flour out of the store, the men in the alley fell silent, watching her. She could feel their eyes on her back as she loaded her supplies, a physical weight of judgment. She did not look at them. She untied Bess, climbed onto the wagon seat, and clicked the reins, urging the old horse into a slow, plodding walk out of town. She kept her face a mask of stone until the last buildings of Dry Creek were behind her. And then she allowed her shoulders to slump, the shame and rage washing over her in a hot, sickening wave. The sky to the west had been turning a bruised purple color all afternoon. By the time she was halfway home, the air had grown heavy and still, the oppressive calm before a storm. The first rumble of thunder echoed from the distant mountains, a low growl that made Bess's ears twitch. Then the wind picked up, no longer a hot rasp, but a cool, damp breath that whipped dust into swirling devils and bent the tall, dry grass to its will. Clara urged Bess on, hoping to make it to the shelter of the barn before the heavens opened up. But the storm was moving faster than she was. A jagged fork of lightning split the darkening sky. followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath the wagon. The first drops of rain fell, fat and heavy, hitting the dusty earth with a sizzle. Within moments, it was a downpour, a torrential sheet of water that soaked her to the skin and turned the dirt road into a slick, greasy mire. Bess, old and steady, plodded on, her head low against the driving rain. Clara pulled her worn hat down, squinting into the deluge. The world had been reduced to a gray, blurry chaos. Then she felt it, a violent lurch, a splintering crack, and the right side of the wagon dropped with a sickening thud. She was thrown against the side of the seat, her hip hitting the wood with a painful jolt. "Whoa! Bess! Whoa!" she yelled over the roar of the storm. The old horse stopped, shivering and snorting nervously. Clara climbed down, her boots sinking ankle-deep into the thick mud. A quick inspection confirmed her fears. The rear right wheel had given way. Its spokes shattered. The wheel itself canted at a miserable angle. It was not a simple repair. The wheel was broken beyond any trailside fix. She was miles from home, caught in a thunderous downpour, with a useless wagon. A curse escaped her lips, snatched away by the wind. She pushed a stray strand of soaked hair from her face and surveyed the situation. There was nothing for it but to unhitch Bess and ride her home, leaving the wagon and the precious supplies to the mercy of the storm. She moved to the front of the wagon, her hands clumsy with cold and frustration as she began to work on the harness. The leather was stiff and slick with rain, and the buckles refused to yield. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down. She grunted with effort, pulling and twisting, her frustration mounting with every failed attempt. Water streamed down her face, indistinguishable from the tears of rage that welled in her eyes. She would not cry. She would not. It was in the midst of this desperate, muddy struggle that she sensed she was no longer alone. It was not a sound, for the storm drowned out everything, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a presence. She looked up, wiping the rain from her eyes with the back of her wrist. A rider had emerged from the gray curtain of rain, a silhouette on a dark horse, watching her. He was as still as a statue, a figure of quiet menace or salvation. She could not tell which. He urged his horse forward, and as he drew closer, she could make out his features. He was a stranger, not from Dry Creek. He wore a dark, rain-slicked duster and a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He looked weary, the kind of weary that comes not from a day's ride, but from a lifetime of them. His face was lean and weathered, with a dark stubble clinging to a square jaw. His eyes, when they met hers, were startlingly clear and held a deep, unreadable sadness. He dismounted without a word, his movements fluid and economical. He did not ask if she needed help. He simply walked to the broken wheel, his boots making squelching sounds in the mud. He knelt, his long duster pooling around him, and examined the damage. He ran a hand over the splintered wood, then stood and looked at her. Clara braced herself for questions, for pity, for the inevitable offer that would put her in his debt. She opened her mouth to tell him she could manage, that she did not need his help, but he did not speak. He just turned and went to his own horse, retrieving a coil of rope and a small tool roll from his saddlebags. He worked in an unnerving silence, broken only by the storm. He used the rope to lash the broken axle to the wagon bed, securing it with practiced, efficient knots. He worked with a quiet competence that was both reassuring and unsettling. Clara stood by, feeling useless, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. The rain plastered her thin dress to her body, and a shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. When he was done, the wagon was still crippled, but it was stable enough to be pulled, slowly, off the road. He gestured for her to take her seat. Hesitantly, she climbed back onto the buckboard. He hitched his own powerful horse alongside Bess, creating a makeshift team. It was a slow, arduous process, But together the two animals managed to drag the crippled wagon to the relative shelter of a small bluff just off the road. He unhitched his horse and then, with the same silent focus, unhitched Bess from the wagon. He checked the mare over for any injuries, his hands gentle and sure on the animal's shivering hide. Finally, his work done. He turned to Clara. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and in the gray light, she could see his face more clearly. There were lines of hardship around his eyes and a scar that cut a thin, white line through his left eyebrow. He looked like a man who had seen too much. "Thank you," she said, her voice sounding raspy and strange in the quiet that followed the storm's fury. "I can manage from here." It was a dismissal, a line drawn in the mud between them. She did not want his help, did not want his presence. Kindness from a stranger was a currency she could not afford. The man simply nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned to his horse. He was preparing to mount when a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning lit up the landscape, striking a gnarled, dead tree on the ridge above them. The explosion of light was followed instantaneously by a deafening boom that felt as if the world were splitting in two. Bess, already on edge, screamed in terror. The old mare reared up, her eyes wide with panic, her hooves flailing wildly. Clara lunged for the reins, but she was too slow. The horse twisted, ready to bolt into the treacherous, muddy plains. Before Clara could even draw another breath, the stranger moved. He was impossibly fast. In 2 long strides, he was beside the panicked animal, his hands shooting out to grab the bridle in a grip of iron. "Easy now, easy," he murmured, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the violent chaos of the moment before. He did not pull or fight the horse. He moved with her, his other hand coming up to stroke her neck, his calm voice a steady anchor in her terror. "You are all right. Just a bit of noise. You are safe." He gentled the animal with a patience that was mesmerizing to watch. Bess's panicked snorts slowly subsided into trembling breaths. She leaned into his touch, her fear draining away under the steady pressure of his hand and the soothing rumble of his voice. It was a small, intimate act of protection, wordless and profound. He held the reins for a moment longer, ensuring the horse was truly calm, before handing them back to Clara. Their fingers brushed, his skin rough and calloused against hers. A strange jolt, like a distant echo of the lightning, shot up her arm. She snatched her hand back as if burned. The stranger looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He seemed about to say something, but he just shook his head slightly, as if changing his mind. Without another glance, he walked back to his horse, swung himself effortlessly into the saddle, and tipped his hat to her. It was a simple, courteous gesture that felt out of place in the raw, desolate landscape. Then he turned his horse and rode away, vanishing back into the gray, drizzling curtain from which he had appeared. Clara stood frozen in the mud, the wet reins clutched in her hand, Bess standing quietly beside her now. She watched the spot where he had disappeared, the empty space he left behind seeming to hum with a strange energy. The rain dripped from the brim of her hat, and the cold had seeped deep into her bones, but inside her chest, behind the wall of ice she had built around her heart, something had stirred. It was a feeling she could not name, a disquieting warmth that was both terrifying and unwelcome. She was alone again, just as she had been moments before. But everything felt different. The silence that descended was no longer empty. It held the echo of a quiet man's voice and the memory of a steady hand in a storm. 3 days passed. The memory of the storm and the stranger faded, buried beneath the weight of relentless work. The sun beat down, baking the mud from the storm into a cracked, pale shell. Clara had managed to drag the broken wagon back to the ranch, a task that had taken the better part of a day and left her muscles screaming in protest. The flour and coffee were safe, but the wheel was a loss. Another debt to be paid in sweat and scarcity. She was on her knees in the meager vegetable patch, pulling weeds with a grim determination. when a shadow fell over her. She did not startle. Her senses were too attuned to the land, to the subtle shifts in sound and light. She had heard the slow, uneven hoofbeats long before he came into view. She rose slowly, wiping her dirt-caked hands on her canvas trousers, and turned. It was him, the stranger from the storm. He was leading his horse, and the animal was favoring its right foreleg. A noticeable limp that spoke of a serious injury. The man himself looked worse than he had in the rain. The weariness she had seen in his eyes was now a deep-etched exhaustion that seemed to settle in his very bones. His duster was caked with mud. His face was gaunt beneath its dark stubble, and a desperate, hunted look flickered in his gaze before he masked it with a stony impassivity. He stopped a respectful distance from her, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was quiet, rough around the edges like a frayed rope. Clara said nothing. She simply waited, her expression unreadable, her hand resting on the handle of the trowel at her belt. It was not a weapon, but it was hard and solid, and having it in her grip was a comfort. "My horse has gone lame," he stated, the words spare and direct. "And I find myself short on funds. I am looking for work, any kind of work. I am strong and I am willing." Clara's mind raced. A drifter. A man with no money and an injured horse was a man running from something, or with nothing left to run to. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to send him on his way. A lone woman could not afford to take in a stranger, a man whose past was a complete unknown. It was dangerous. It was foolish. It would set every tongue in Dry Creek wagging until they were raw. But then she looked past him, at the barn with its sagging roof that the next big wind might peel away. She looked at the half-finished irrigation ditch she had been digging from the well, a task that was proving too much for her alone. She thought of the small crop of hay she needed to bring in before it baked to useless straw in the sun. She was tired. A deep, soul-crushing weariness had settled in her, and for the first time, she was not certain her own stubborn will was enough to hold this place together. And she remembered the storm. She remembered the quiet competence of his hands, the steady calm in his voice as he gentled her panicked horse. He had not asked for payment then. He had helped her and ridden away without a backward glance. "I cannot pay you much," she heard herself say, the words feeling alien on her tongue. "A few dollars at the end of the month. A roof over your head in the barn. 3 meals a day. The work is hard, and it does not end until the sun goes down." A flicker of relief, so faint it was almost imperceptible, crossed his face. "That is more than fair, ma'am. I will not be a burden." "What is your name?" she asked, her tone still clipped and businesslike. "Luke McKenna." "Clara Dawson," she replied, though she suspected he already knew. "The barn is yours. There is a clean stall at the end. You can see to your horse. There is water at the well. Supper is at sundown." She turned back to her weeding, a clear dismissal. She could feel his eyes on her for a moment before he gave a slight nod and led his limping horse toward the barn. As he walked away, Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "What have you done?" a voice screamed inside her head. But another, quieter part of her felt a sliver of something she had not felt in 2 years, a fragile, terrifying hint of relief. Luke McKenna was a man of few words and much labor. He moved into the barn without fuss, creating a small, tidy space for himself in the tack room. He spent the first day tending to his horse, a big roan he called Shadow, his hands gentle and knowing as he cleaned and wrapped the swollen leg. From the second day on, he worked. He rose before she did, and by the time she came out of the cabin with the milk pail, he would have already mucked out the stalls and started on whatever task needed doing. His presence was a constant, unsettling thing. He was a quiet force of nature, as steady and relentless as the sun. He fixed the barn roof, his hammer blows echoing through the long, hot afternoons. He finished digging the irrigation ditch in 2 days, a job that would have taken her 2 weeks. He mended the section of fence that had been a constant trouble, his posts set deep and true. He worked with an intensity that seemed driven by something more than the promise of a month's wages. It was as if the physical labor was a balm for some internal wound, a way to keep his own ghosts at bay. He never crossed her boundaries. He never came to the house unless she called him for a meal. He ate his food in silence, his eyes on his plate, and would thank her quietly before retreating back to the barn. He never spoke of his past, never asked about hers. He existed within the small world of her ranch like a phantom, a strong, silent presence that she was constantly, acutely aware of. It unnerved her. His quiet respect was more disarming than any forwardness. She had built her walls high to keep the world out, but he was not trying to scale them. He was just there, and his being there made the walls feel thin and brittle. It did not take long for the whispers in Dry Creek to begin again, this time with a new, sharper edge. When Clara rode into town for supplies the following week, the change was palpable. The stares were no longer just pitying or scornful. They were speculative, laced with a smug, knowing curiosity. "I see you have taken on some help, Mrs. Dawson." "Mr." Abernathy said as he weighed her flour, his voice dripping with false geniality. "The harvest will not wait," Clara replied, her voice cold. As she left the mercantile, Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, stopped her on the boardwalk, her face a mask of pious concern. "My dear Clara," she began, her voice low and conspiratorial, "a woman in your position must be so careful to have a man, a drifter, living under your roof. People will talk. It is a matter of Christian decency." "My soul is my own concern, Mrs. Gable," Clara said, her voice tight with anger. "And the work on my ranch is my own business." She walked away, her back rigid, leaving the woman sputtering in her wake. Luke had ridden into town with her, on Bess, to get a new shoe for the mare at the blacksmith's. He had said nothing, but he saw it all. He stood across the street, his arms crossed, and watched. He saw the way Mr. Abernathy's thumb seemed to press down on the scale. He saw the way a group of ranchers from the Kane property stopped their conversation to watch Clara, their leering smiles and low comments making his jaw tighten. He saw the cold shoulder she received from the other women, the way they would gather their skirts and cross the street to avoid her. A quiet, simmering anger began to burn in his gut. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before, in other towns, in other places. He had seen how people could turn on someone they deemed different, how they could use gossip and scorn as weapons. He had not expected to find it aimed at a woman whose only crime was a refusal to break. That night, another thunderstorm rolled in, a mirror of the one that had brought them together. The sky rumbled, and flashes of lightning illuminated the stark landscape. They ate their supper of beans and cornbread in the small cabin, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. The storm outside filled the silence that usually sat between them. Clara found herself staring out the window at the rain lashing against the glass. The sound of it, the smell of it, brought the memory of that day on the road back with a sharp clarity. Without thinking, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. "The raid came on a night like this," she said. "There was a storm. I always thought the thunder covered the sound of them coming." Luke stopped eating, his fork halfway to his mouth. He did not say anything. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and patient. Waiting. It was the first time she had ever offered a piece of her past, and he seemed to understand the weight of the moment. Encouraged by his silence, by the absence of the pity she so despised, she continued, her eyes still fixed on the darkness outside. "Elias, my husband, he went out to check on the livestock. I was inside with Thomas, my son." She spoke the word son as if it were a fragile, precious thing she had not dared to touch for a very long time. "He was only 4. He was afraid of the thunder. I was holding him, singing to him. When the door broke open, I did not even have time to scream." Her voice faltered, and she took a shaky breath. They took Elias first. Then they came into the house. I buried them both the next day, right up on that hill." She gestured vaguely with her head toward the window. "The ground was so hard. It took me all day to dig. Thomas's grave was so small." A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She angrily wiped it away. She had not cried in 2 years, and she would not start now. Not in front of this stranger. She braced herself for the inevitable clumsy words of comfort, the empty platitudes people offered when faced with a grief too large to comprehend. But Luke offered none of that. He was quiet for a long time. The only sounds, the drumming of the rain and the distant roll of thunder. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with an emotion she could not identify. "No one," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the small table, "should have had to bury that much alone." It was not pity. It was a simple, profound acknowledgement of her pain. He was not looking at her as a fragile widow, but as a fellow survivor of some unspoken, private war. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own sorrow, a shared understanding of loss that transcended words. In that moment, something shifted between them. The wall of ice around her heart did not melt, but a small, hairline crack appeared. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of something like it, an understanding. The fight happened 2 days later. They had ridden into town together again, needing to purchase seed for a late-season planting. As they were tying their horses outside the mercantile, 2 men stumbled out of the saloon. Clara recognized them instantly as Jebediah Cain's top hands, a burly, red-faced man named Silas and his lanky, sneering companion, Walt. They were both drunk, their movements clumsy and their voices loud. They spotted Clara and Luke, and Silas grinned, a mean, predatory expression. "Well, look here, Walt," he boomed, his voice slurring. "It is the merry widow Dawson. Looks like she has finally found a stud to work her fields." Walt snickered. "Heard she likes them quiet, so she can do all the hollering herself in the barn at night." Clara's face went pale, a mixture of fury and humiliation. She ignored them, turning her back to unload a sack from Bess's saddle. Luke stood perfectly still, his body coiled like a spring. He did not look at the men. He just looked at Clara, at the rigid set of her shoulders and the trembling of her hands. "Leave it be," she muttered to him, her voice low and fierce. But Silas was not finished. He swaggered over, getting too close, his breath a foul mix of whiskey and chewing tobacco. "What is the matter, sweetheart?" he taunted, reaching out a grubby hand as if to touch her arm. "Not friendly today? Or is this one here keeping you too tired to be polite?" That was the line. Before Silas's fingers could even brush her sleeve, Luke moved. He was not fast like a brawler. He was swift and silent like a predator. He stepped between Clara and the rancher, his body shielding hers. He did not say a word. He simply looked at Silas, and the look in his eyes was cold and flat and utterly devoid of fear. "What's your problem, drifter?" Silas spat, emboldened by the whiskey. He shoved Luke in the chest. "This does not concern you." Luke did not budge. He absorbed the shove without moving an inch. "You are done talking to the lady," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Silas laughed and threw a clumsy punch. Luke deflected it with an almost casual motion, and then his own fist shot out, a hard, precise jab that caught Silas square on the jaw with a sickening crack. The big man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the dusty street in a heap. Walt, momentarily stunned, let out a yell and charged, pulling a knife from his belt. Luke met the charge, turning his body and using the man's momentum against him. He caught Walt's knife hand, twisting it viciously. The knife clattered to the ground as Walt screamed in pain. Luke drove his other fist into the man's stomach, doubling him over, and then brought his knee up hard into his face. Walt collapsed beside his partner, groaning and spitting blood. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The street, which had been bustling a moment before, was now silent. People stared from doorways and windows. Luke stood over the two men, breathing evenly, his chest rising and falling. There was no triumph on his face, only a cold, contained rage. He looked down at his knuckles, which were scraped and bleeding, then turned to Clara. Without a word, he took the sack from her nerveless hands, threw it over his shoulder, and strode into the mercantile. Clara was left standing in the street, the town silent, judging eyes all on her. She tended to his wounds back at the ranch. In the dim light of the cabin, he sat at the table while she stood before him with a bowl of water and a clean rag. Her hands trembled as she dabbed at the cut on his cheek and the raw skin of his knuckles. The silence was thick with unspoken words. The fight had changed everything. He had drawn a line in the sand, not for himself, but for her. He had made her his business. "I did not ask you to fight for me," she finally whispered. Her voice choked with a confusing mix of gratitude and fear. It was an accusation, a plea for him to let her keep her solitude, to let her fight her own battles, even if she was losing them. She needed him to understand that she did not need a savior. Luke looked up at her, his clear eyes meeting her troubled ones. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by that familiar, deep-seated sadness. He reached up and gently caught her trembling hand, stilling it against his cheek. "Did not do it for you to ask," he said softly. His voice was a low murmur, but his words landed with the force of a physical blow. It was not an apology. It was a statement, a declaration that stripped away all her defenses, leaving her feeling more exposed and vulnerable than she had in years. The aftermath of the fight in Dry Creek was a toxic silence that followed Clara home and settled over her ranch like a shroud. Luke's bruised knuckles had healed, but the wound he had torn in the town's fragile social fabric only festered. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a low, persistent hum of condemnation. The story of the brawl, twisted and embellished with every telling, solidified into a sordid tale of a fallen widow and the violent drifter she had taken into her bed. Less than a week later, they came. Clara saw the buggy kicking up a plume of dust on the road, and her stomach tightened into a cold knot. It was Preacher Gable, his severe, black-clad figure seated beside his wife, whose face was a mask of grim piety. Luke was reinforcing a corner post of the corral, his back to the approaching visitors. He paused, his hammer held mid-swing, and looked at her. His eyes asked a silent question. "Keep working," Clara said, her voice flat and hard. "This is my business." She stood on the porch of the small cabin, her arms crossed, a solitary, defiant figure waiting for the verdict to be delivered. The preacher pulled the buggy to a halt and helped his wife down. They approached the house as if stepping into a den of iniquity, their faces set in expressions of solemn duty. "Clara," Preacher Gable began, his voice imbued with a sorrowful authority that set her teeth on edge. "We have come out of concern for your immortal soul." "My soul is between me and God, Preacher," Clara replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "It is our duty as a Christian community to guide those who have strayed from the path." "Mrs. Gable chimed in, her sharp eyes darting past Clara to where Luke was methodically driving a nail into the post. The sound of the hammer was the only other noise, each blow landing with a sharp, punctuating finality. To house an unmarried man, a man of violence and unknown character, it is an affront to decency. It is a sin in the eyes of the Lord. "The Lord knows I needed a hired hand for the harvest," Clara stated, her gaze as unyielding as granite. "Mr. McKenna works for his keep. That is all." "People do not see it that way, child," the preacher said, his tone softening into a condescending pity. "They see a woman who has forgotten the sanctity of her marriage vows, who has taken a brute into the home her husband built for her. We are here to implore you, send this man away. Come back to the church, repent, and let us help you redeem your good name." Redeem her name. The words were a lit match to the dry tinder of her anger. Her name had been dragged through the mud of this town since the day she buried her husband. They had called her cursed, proud, and unnatural. Now, because she had dared to accept help, because a man had defended her from the town's own bullies, they called her a sinner. The hypocrisy was a bitter gall in her throat. "I thank you for your concern, Preacher Mrs. Gable," she said, the politeness of her words a stark contrast to the ice in her voice. "But I will not be needing your guidance. This is my land. The people on it are my concern. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do." She turned without another word and walked back into the cabin, shutting the door firmly behind her. She stood in the dim interior, her back pressed against the rough wood, her heart pounding with a cold, contained fury. She listened as the buggy turned and rumbled away, carrying the town's judgment with it. The visit changed everything. A hard, bitter shell formed over the crack in her heart. She saw now that she had been foolish to let anyone in, even a little kindness, connection, affection. They were not shelters from the storm. They were magnets for lightning. They drew ruin. Elias and Thomas were gone. This ranch was all she had left, and she would not lose it to the pious venom of her neighbors. To protect it, she had to be what they already thought she was, a woman made of stone. She became cold, distant, even to Luke. The tentative understanding that had begun to grow between them withered under the frost of her renewed isolation. She stopped calling him into the cabin for supper. Instead, she would leave a plate of food for him on an overturned crate just inside the barn door, a clear and deliberate message. He was the hired hand. She was the proprietor. The line between them was to be absolute. Her orders were clipped and impersonal, delivered in the morning before they began their separate labors. "The south fence needs mending. The well pump is sticking again." She avoided his eyes, refused to engage in any conversation beyond the necessities of the day's work. She was shutting him out, trying to erase the intimacy of a shared story in a thunderstorm, the raw connection of a fight fought on her behalf. Luke bore her coldness with the same quiet stoicism he applied to everything else. He did the work, his movements as steady and efficient as ever, but she saw the change in him. The watchfulness in his eyes returned, and a familiar sadness seemed to settle more heavily on his broad shoulders. He understood what she was doing. He saw the fear behind her anger, and he knew he was the cause of it. He had brought the town's wrath down upon her, and now she was paying the price. One morning, well before dawn, Clara was awakened by a sense of wrongness. The usual pre-dawn sounds of the ranch were there, the soft rustle of the animals, the whisper of the wind. But something was missing. She dressed quickly and stepped outside. The air was cold and carried the scent of dust and damp earth. In the gray, ethereal light, she saw him. Luke was by the corral, his bedroll tied neatly behind his saddle. Shadow, his roan, stood patiently, its leg now fully healed. He was preparing to leave. A sudden, sharp panic seized her, so fierce it stole her breath. He was leaving. He was going to walk away and leave her alone with the ghosts and the judgment and the failing land. The thought of the silence descending again, heavier and more absolute than before, was unbearable. She had pushed him away, and now he was going. It was what she thought she wanted, but the reality of it felt like a gaping wound. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the cold ground. He heard her approach and turned, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You have done the work I paid you for," she said, her voice sounding strange and hollow to her own ears. "You are free to go." It was a lie. She had not paid him yet. He simply nodded, his eyes holding hers. He looked tired, sad, but resolute. "I have caused you nothing but trouble. Mrs. Dawson, the town, they will not leave you be as long as I am here. You will be better off without me." He was right, logically. She knew he was right. Sending him away was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But since when had her life been about safety? It was about survival, and in some deep, unspoken part of herself, she knew her survival was now intertwined with his. He turned to mount his horse. "No," she said, the word a raw croak. He stopped, his foot in the stirrup. She took a breath, fighting for control. She could not ask him to stay. She could not admit that she needed him. Her pride was a fortress, the only one she had left, so she found other words. Hard words. Words that sounded like an order, not a plea. She gestured toward the half-rebuilt frame of the barn they had been working on together. "You fix what you start, Mr. McKenna." He looked from her to the barn and back again. A long, silent moment passed between them, the sky slowly beginning to lighten in the east. He understood. She was not just talking about the barn. She was talking about the faint spark of hope he had lit in the darkness of her life. She was talking about the crack he had put in her armor. He had started something, and he had no right to walk away from the consequences. Slowly, he took his foot out of the stirrup. He untied his bedroll and set it on the ground. He did not say a word. He did not have to. He was staying. Their work fell into a new rhythm after that morning. The cold distance she had tried to enforce was gone, replaced by a tense, charged cooperation. They worked on the barn together, a silent, synchronized team. He would lift a heavy beam into place, his muscles straining, and she would be there to secure it, her movements quick and sure. He would anticipate her need for the hammer, his hand extending it to her just as she was reaching for it. She would bring him a dipper of water from the well in the heat of the afternoon, their fingers brushing as he took it, a jolt of awareness passing between them. The silence was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with 1,000 unspoken things, with the shared weight of their circumstances, with the quiet hum of a connection that refused to be severed. They were two solitary people, bound together by a command, building something tangible with their hands while a more fragile, invisible structure was being erected between them. Every shared task, every small gesture of cooperation was a brick laid in that foundation. The prairie fire started in late September, born of a lightning strike in the dry grasslands miles to the south. For a day, it was just a smudge of brown smoke on the horizon, a distant worry. But the wind shifted, blowing hot and steady from the south, and the smudge grew into a billowing, angry cloud that devoured the sky. By late afternoon, the air was thick with the smell of burning grass, and a terrifying orange glow pulsed on the horizon like a malevolent heartbeat. "It is moving fast," Luke said, his voice grim as he stood beside her, watching the advancing threat. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Clara's throat, but she swallowed it down. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. "The animals," she said, her voice tight. "We have to get them to the creek bed." There was no time for a plan, only for action. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy, their movements a blur of controlled chaos. Luke threw open the corral gate, and together they herded the 2 cows and Old Bess toward the relative safety of the deep, dry gully that cut through her property. The animals were skittish, their eyes wide with terror, their nostrils flaring at the scent of smoke. As they secured the livestock, the fire crested the last ridge, and Clara's heart stopped. It was no longer a distant glow. It was a living, breathing monster, a roaring wall of flame that stretched for a mile in either direction, consuming everything in its path. The sound was a deafening roar, and the heat was a physical blow, so intense it seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. "The troughs! The well!" Luke yelled over the din. "We have to save the water!" They ran, their lungs burning from the smoke-filled air. They soaked burlap sacks in the horse trough, the water precious and irreplaceable. Then they began the brutal, hopeless work of fighting back the fire. They ran along the edge of her property, beating at the advancing flames with the wet sacks, trying to create a fire break. The heat was scorching, raising blisters on their skin. The smoke was a blinding, choking fog. They moved as one, A desperate two-person army against an inferno. He would beat back a section of flames, and she would be right behind him, stamping out the glowing embers with her thick-soled boots. They fell into a rhythm of shared desperation. There was no thought, only instinct. The world was reduced to the roar of the fire, the burn of the smoke, and the solid, reassuring presence of the other person fighting beside them in the hellish glow. Time ceased to exist. They fought until their muscles screamed, until their lungs felt ready to burst, until they were moving on sheer will alone. Finally, mercifully, the main wall of fire passed them by, its insatiable hunger driving it north. It had skirted the very edge of her property, denied its prize by the creek bed on one side and their own desperate efforts on the other. They collapsed to the ground, side by side, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. They were covered in soot and ash, their faces streaked with sweat, their clothes singed. For a long time they just lay there, gasping for breath, watching the blackened, smoldering horizon. The fire had taken the pasture land, turning it into a desolate, smoking wasteland. But the house, the barn, the well, they were safe. They had survived. Clara pushed herself up onto her elbows, her whole body aching. She looked at the devastation, at the scorched earth that stretched as far as she could see. All that work, all that struggle, wiped out in an afternoon. A wave of utter despair washed over her, so powerful it buckled her knees. "Everything I touch," she whispered, her voice breaking on a dry sob, "burns." It was the raw, bleeding truth of her life. Her husband, her son, her land. Everything she loved, everything she fought for was destined for ruin. Luke pushed himself to a sitting position beside her. He looked at her, his face grimed with soot, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Then let me burn with you," he said, his voice low and raspy. His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was not offering to save her from the fire. He was offering to stand in it with her. He was accepting her curse, her ruin, as his own. She turned to look at him, and in the eerie twilight of the smoke-filled sky, she saw her own pain mirrored in his eyes. She saw a man who was no stranger to burning things. In that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled. The wall she had built around her heart, the fortress of pride and self-reliance, turned to ash and blew away on the smoky wind. She leaned into him, and he put his arms around her, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hesitant, clumsy, tasting of smoke and desperation and shared survival. It was the kiss of two people who had been to the edge of destruction and back, two souls clinging to each other in the ruins. His lips were chapped and rough against hers, and her hands came up to clutch at his shirt as if she were afraid of falling. There was more pain in it than pleasure, more sorrow than joy. It was a raw, aching acknowledgement of everything they had lost and everything they had endured. But as the kiss deepened, something else ignited between them, a spark in the ashes, a flicker of warmth in the cold devastation. It was a feeling so powerful, so overwhelming, that it terrified her. It was need, a desperate, consuming need for another person, a need she had denied for 2 long, empty years. The terror was more powerful than the fire had been. She broke the kiss, pulling away with a gasp, her breath coming in ragged spurts. She scrambled back, away from him, away from the terrifying vulnerability he represented. She had survived by being an island. To need someone was to give them the power to destroy her. It was a weakness she could not afford. "I do not need saving," she said, the words her shield, her mantra, the core of her identity. She said it to him, but she was saying it to herself, trying to rebuild the walls his kiss had shattered. Luke looked at her, his expression raw with 1,000 emotions she could not decipher. His hand was still outstretched, hovering in the space she had just vacated. He let it fall to his side. "Then let me just love you," he replied, and his voice was so soft it was almost lost in the wind. But it cracked with a quiet, desperate intensity that broke her heart all over again. Luke's words, "Then let me just love you," were not a question that required an answer. They were a statement of fact, a truth that settled into the scorched earth around them and took root. Clara never answered him, not with words. She answered him in the quiet moments that followed, in the days and weeks that bled into a fragile, secret autumn. Their life together found a new, unspoken rhythm. The line between the cabin and the barn dissolved. He started taking his supper at her table again, and soon after, he began taking his coffee with her on the porch as the sun rose, a silent ritual that became the anchor of their days. They did not speak of love. The word was too big, too dangerous, a ghost from a life that no longer existed for either of them. Instead, their affection lived in the spaces between words. It was in the way his hand would find the small of her back to steady her as they hoisted a new beam for the barn. It was in the way she would leave a bowl of stew warming for him on the stove when he worked late. A small, maternal gesture that felt both strange and deeply right. It was in the lingering glances across the lamp-lit cabin at night. Glances that held a universe of shared hardship, quiet understanding, and a tenderness that frightened them both with its intensity. They were a secret unto themselves, a tiny island of solace in a hostile world. In the evenings, he would sometimes sit and clean his gun with methodical precision, the quiet clicks of the metal a soothing sound in the stillness. She would sit nearby, mending a shirt, the simple domesticity of the scene a balm on her raw nerves. In these moments, surrounded by the vast, lonely silence of the plains, she felt a quiet comfort she had thought was lost to her forever. It was not happiness, not the easy, sunlit happiness of her life before. It was something more precarious, more precious, a hard-won peace, a shared warmth against the encroaching cold. But the cold was relentless. While they carved out their fragile peace, the town of Dry Creek was nursing its venom. Their isolation was a condemnation in itself, and the town's judgment, denied a direct outlet, began to curdle into something meaner and more active. It started small. A merchant in a neighboring town, a man who knew folks from Dry Creek, suddenly refused to sell her seed on credit. The blacksmith found a reason to be too busy to mend her tools. These were slights, inconveniences meant to remind her of her status as an outcast. Then, one cold morning in late October, the cruelty took on a newer, more monstrous form. She had risen before dawn, leaving Luke sleeping in the small cot he had set up in the corner of her cabin, stepping outside into the gray, misty air. She walked toward the main gate to check a loose hinge, and then she saw it. Hanging from the gatepost was the small, lifeless body of a newborn calf, one of her own, its neck broken. It was a sickening, heartbreaking sight, a violation that struck her to the core. Her eyes filled with hot tears of rage and sorrow. Then her gaze fell on the gate itself, carved into the weathered wood in crude, deep gashes was a single, hateful word: whore. The air left her lungs in a rush. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was not just a word. It was a brand, a sentence delivered by a jury of her neighbors. It was a physical manifestation of all their poisonous whispers, brought to her doorstep and left to rot with the body of an innocent animal. This was not about disapproval anymore. This was a threat. This was a promise of violence. She did not scream. She did not cry. A terrifying, glacial calm settled over her. She turned, walked back to the cabin, and took down the rifle from its pegs on the wall. She went back to the gate, cut down the poor animal, and carried its small, surprisingly heavy body to the rise where her husband and son were buried. She dug a third, small grave, her movements mechanical, her face a mask of stone. When Luke woke and came outside, he found her staring at the word on the gate, the empty shovel still in her hand. He saw the dead look in her eyes, and then he saw the carving. A low, animalistic sound of rage escaped his throat. He took a step toward his horse, his hands clenched into fists, a murderous intent hardening his face. "No," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "You will not." "Clara, You will not," she repeated, turning to face him. The woman he had shared quiet mornings with was gone. In her place was a stranger with eyes as hard and cold as river stones. "This has gone far enough. It is over." "I am not leaving you here to deal with this alone," he said, his voice a low growl. "You are the reason this is happening," she snapped, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She had to be cruel. It was the only way. "Before you came, they pitied me, they scorned me, but they left me alone. You brought this, your fight, your presence. You brought their hate to my door." The word struck him like a physical blow. He flinched, the anger draining from his face to be replaced by a familiar, deep-seated pain. He saw the lie in her eyes, but he also saw the genuine terror beneath it. She was not angry at him. She was terrified for him. She believed, in that moment, that she was a curse, and that her curse was now upon him. "Pack your things," she said, her voice breaking slightly before she mastered it again. "I want you gone by midday." He held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment, a silent conversation passing between them. He wanted to argue, to refuse, to tell her they could face it together, but he saw the brittle resolve in her, the sheer, desperate force of her will. She was doing this to protect him, and to fight her on it would only cause her more pain. He gave a single, slow nod. He turned and walked to the cabin without another word. She watched him go, her heart splintering into 1,000 pieces. She had done it. She had saved him by destroying the only good thing she had left in her life. She stood by the gate, her hand tracing the hateful letters carved into the wood, and waited. An hour later, he emerged, his bedroll on his back and his saddlebag slung over his shoulder. He walked to Shadow, saddled the roan, and mounted. He rode to the gate where she was still standing, a sentinel at the ruins of her own happiness. He looked down at her, his face a mask of sorrow. "I am sorry for the trouble I brought you, Clara," he said quietly. She could not speak. She just shook her head, a small, tight gesture of denial. He reached into his pocket and held out a small, folded piece of paper. "I do not have much, but your wages." "Keep it," she said, her voice a harsh whisper. "You earned it." He looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with a world of unspoken pain. Then he turned his horse and rode away, not looking back. She watched him until he was a tiny speck on the vast, empty plain. And then she watched until the speck was gone and there was nothing but the dust and the wind and the terrible, echoing silence he left behind. She did not move for a long time. When she finally returned to the cabin, she found the folded piece of paper lying on the small kitchen table. She picked it up with trembling fingers. It was not money. It was a note, written in a rough, hesitant script. "You are the only peace I have known." A dry, racking sob tore itself from her throat, the first sound of grief she had allowed herself. She sank to the floor, clutching the piece of paper to her chest, and wept in the crushing, absolute solitude of the house that was no longer a home. The months that followed were a long, slow descent into a private hell. The drought that had been threatening all summer finally took hold, and the land grew hard and brittle. The creek bed turned to bone dust. The well water grew scant and bitter. Clara worked from sunup to sundown, a grim, solitary automaton. The physical labor was a punishment she inflicted on herself, a way to numb the constant, grinding ache of her loneliness. But there was no escape. Luke's absence was a physical presence. She saw him everywhere, in the repaired roof of the barn, in the sturdy fence posts he had set, in the empty chair across from her at the supper table. The peace he had brought was gone, replaced by a bitterness that poisoned everything. She hated the town for their cruelty. She hated the land for its betrayal. And most of all, she hated herself for her weakness, for sending away the one person who had seen the woman behind the widow's weeds. News from the outside world came in trickles, carried by the wind. She avoided Dry Creek altogether now, making the long, arduous journey to a trading post in Sonora County for her meager supplies. It was there, nearly 4 months after she had sent Luke away, that she heard his name. She was standing by the counter, waiting for the merchant to weigh out her beans, when she overheard 2 prospectors talking. "Heard they arrested that drifter, McKenna," one of them said. "The one who laid out the Kane boys over in Dry Creek." Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. "What for?" the other asked. "Stuck his nose where it was not wanted. Sheriff down in Verde Valley says he got between a rope and a Mexican horse thief. Seems a local rancher caught the man stealing, and was about to serve up some frontier justice with his whole family watching. McKenna stepped in, said the man deserved a trial, caused a whole uproar. Now he is sitting in the Verde jail, and folks are saying he is likely to hang for it." Clara's bag of beans fell from her numb fingers, spilling across the dusty floorboards. The world narrowed to a single, roaring point. Luke in jail, facing a rope, because he had done what he always did. He had stood up for someone who could not stand up for themselves. He had defended the defenseless. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to turn around, to get on her horse, and to ride back to the hollow safety of her ranch. He was not her problem anymore. She had sent him away, but the memory of his face, the feel of his hand on her shoulder as the world burned around them, the echo of his voice saying her name, it was stronger than her fear. She left the spilled beans on the floor and walked out of the trading post. She rode hard for 2 days, fueled by a terrifying, desperate energy. The journey to Verde Valley was a pilgrimage through a sun-beaten purgatory. The roads were nothing more than dusty tracks. The heat was a physical weight, and the landscape was a blur of brown and gray. She was a woman possessed, pushing best to the limits of the old mare's endurance, when she finally rode into the small, gritty town of Verde. She was coated in a thick layer of dust, her eyes burning from the sun and lack of sleep. The stares she received here were different. They were not filled with scorn, but with a weary, pitying curiosity. They saw a desperate woman, come to see a condemned man. The jail was a squat, ugly building made of stone, with one barred window facing the street. It smelled of stale sweat, fear, and cheap whiskey. A portly, bored-looking deputy led her down a short, dark hallway to his cell. And there he was. He was thinner, his face gaunter than she remembered, and there was a fresh bruise along his jaw. He was sitting on a narrow cot, his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes widened in disbelief. He looked tired and broken, but when he saw her, a flicker of the man she knew, the quiet, steady man who had faced down storms and fires, returned to his gaze. "Clara," he breathed, his voice rough. She stood before the bars, her hands clutching the sack she had brought. It held a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, and a clean shirt. It was a pathetic offering against the weight of his fate. "Luke," she said, her own voice trembling. He rose and came to the bars, his movements slow and stiff. They stood there for a long moment, the inches of iron between them feeling like 1,000 miles. "Why did you come?" he asked, his voice a low, painful whisper. Clara looked into his tired, haunted eyes, and the simple, devastating truth was the only answer she had. Because no one else would. A pained expression crossed his face, and he gripped the bars, his knuckles white. She pushed the sack through the bars, and he took it, their fingers brushing for a brief, electric moment. He asked her about the ranch, and she told him about the drought, her words clipped and spare. She did not tell him about the loneliness, about the note she kept folded in her pocket, its creases worn soft from her touch. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. He looked away from her, his gaze turning inward, to a place of dark memory. "I fought in the war," he said suddenly, his voice flat. "They told us we were fighting for a great cause, for union, for freedom. But all I saw was boys killing other boys. Farmers from Georgia killing farmers from Pennsylvania." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "My brother, Samuel, he enlisted with me. He was younger, looked up to me. I was supposed to protect him." He stared at the stone wall, but she knew he was seeing something else entirely. "There was a battle at a place called Cold Harbor. The smoke was so thick you could not see your own hands in front of your face. It was just noise and screaming and confusion. We were ordered to charge. I lost sight of Samuel in the smoke. I saw a figure coming at me, wearing gray. I raised my rifle. I fired. It was not until I was standing over him that I saw his face." He stopped, his throat working. He did not need to finish the story. Clara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. His own brother. "It was my fault," he whispered, the words ragged with a grief that was decades old but still raw. "I should have held my fire. I killed him. Clara, I killed my own brother. After that, I just started walking. I have been walking ever since. A man who kills his own kin. He does not deserve peace. He does not deserve to be saved." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrible, naked pain, revealing the source of the profound sadness he carried. He was not just a drifter. He was a penitent, wandering in a wilderness of his own making. Clara reached through the bars, her hand covering his where it gripped the cold iron. He did not pull away. His skin was cold. "Then we both carry ghosts," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. In that moment, she understood everything about him. His quietness, his gentleness, his fierce, protective instinct. He was a man trying to atone for a sin he could never undo. He carried his ghost, just as she carried hers. That night, she did not sleep. She sat in the town's only boarding house, staring out the window at the dark, silent jail. She could not leave him here. She could not let him hang for an act of decency. His confession had not repulsed her. It had forged the final, unbreakable link between them. They were two broken halves of the same soul. Just before midnight, she walked back to the jail. The portly deputy was dozing in a chair, his feet up on the desk. She walked in, the sound of her boots on the floorboards startling him awake. "What do you want, lady?" he grumbled. "Visiting hours are over." She placed her worn leather purse on his desk. It did not make much of a sound. It contained every last dollar she had in the world. "I am here on behalf of a federal marshal," she said, her voice steady and cold, a lie born of pure desperation. "McKenna is being transferred. I am here to take custody." The deputy eyed her, then the purse. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A federal marshal sends a woman alone? That is a good one." "The marshal is waiting outside of town," she improvised, her mind racing. "He did not want to cause a stir. The prisoner is a federal witness. He is wanted for testimony against war criminals." She was spinning a tale from thin air, praying it was enough. The deputy's eyes narrowed. He looked at the purse again, his greed warring with his suspicion. He licked his lips. "I do not know. I would need to see some official papers." "The papers are with the marshal," Clara said, "but he authorized me to offer you this for your silence and your cooperation. A bonus for a difficult job done quietly." She opened the purse. The sight of the cash, meager as it was, made his eyes gleam. It was not much, but to a small-town deputy, it was a small fortune. He wrestled with it for a moment. Then his shoulders slumped in a gesture of corrupt resignation. This was easier than paperwork, and far more profitable. He picked up the heavy ring of keys from his desk. "Federal witness, you say?" he said, not even trying to sound convinced. "All right, lady. He is all yours. But if anyone asks, he was gone when I came on my shift." He walked down the hall, the jangle of the keys echoing in the silent building. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. So loud she was sure he could hear it. She had just risked everything. Her ranch, her freedom, her life. All for the man with ghosts in his eyes. There was a loud, metallic clink, followed by the grating squeal of a key turning in a rusty lock. The sound of freedom, the sound of damnation. She did not know which. The key turning in the lock was the loudest sound Clara had ever heard. It was the crack of a life breaking, the groan of a new and dangerous path opening before them. The deputy pulled the heavy door open, his face a mixture of greed and unease. Luke stood in the doorway, momentarily blinded by the lamplight from the office, his silhouette a stark, uncertain shape. He looked at Clara, his eyes wide with 1,000 questions she could not answer. "Come on," she whispered, her voice a raw, urgent command. "There is no time." There was no discussion, no plan. There was only the frantic, primal instinct to flee. She led him to where she had left Bess and his own horse, Shadow, which she had retrieved from the town's livery, in the suffocating darkness of a moonless night. They mounted and rode out of Verde Valley, not toward the familiar north of her ranch, but west, into the vast, unknown territory that stretched toward the Arizona border. They rode under a blanket of stars so thick and bright it seemed to mock their dark, earthbound desperation. They moved like ghosts through a sleeping world, the rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats a frantic heartbeat against the profound silence of the plains. They crossed arid, rock-strewn landscapes where the wind whispered through skeletal saguaros, then descended into deep canyons where the shadows were as black and cold as the grave. This was a land that did not care for the troubles of men, a vast, indifferent wilderness that could swallow them whole without a trace. With every mile they put between themselves and the jail, the initial, adrenaline-fueled rush of the escape began to fade, replaced by the cold, heavy reality of what they had done. They were fugitives. Clara had traded her hard-won, lonely existence for the life of a wanted criminal. Luke, who had been running from his past for years, was now running from the law, and he had dragged her down with him. A terrible silence grew between them as they rode. It was no longer the comfortable, understanding silence of their mornings on the ranch. It was a chasm of unspoken fear and guilt. Luke's guilt was a palpable thing, radiating from him in waves. He rode with his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the treacherous ground ahead, his face set in a grim, tormented mask. He had brought ruin to the one person who had shown him kindness, the one person who represented the peace he had long since given up on. He had allowed her to risk everything for him, a man who believed he was worth nothing. The self-loathing gnawed at him, a more vicious jailer than any deputy. Clara's fear manifested as a cold, brittle pragmatism. She became the leader of their desperate flight, her senses honed to a razor's edge. She was the one who scouted for water, who chose their hiding places during the punishing daylight hours, who rationed their meager supplies with a miser's care. This relentless focus on survival was her only defense against the paralyzing terror that threatened to consume her. The fear of losing him, now that she had found him again, was a physical ache in her chest, so profound that she could not allow herself to feel it. To feel it would be to break. So she became hard, distant, her voice clipped and her movements efficient. She walled herself off from him, and from her own heart, retreating into the familiar fortress of solitude even as he rode beside her. Days bled into a grueling routine. They would find shelter before dawn, usually in a rocky outcrop or a thick grove of mesquite, and try to sleep through the worst of the heat, their horses hidden and quiet. As dusk fell, they would ride again, pushing ever westward, with no destination in mind beyond away. After nearly a week of this punishing travel, they stumbled upon it, an abandoned mining camp, tucked away in a high, narrow canyon. It was a ghost town, a collection of skeletal, collapsing structures bleached silver by the sun and wind. A caved-in mine shaft gaped like an open mouth in the side of the canyon, and the rusted hulks of ore carts lay overturned like dead beetles. It was a place of failure and forgotten dreams, a fitting sanctuary for two people who had lost everything. They chose the most intact of the shacks, a small cabin whose roof had only partially collapsed. Inside, the wind moaned through the gaps in the walls, and the floor was thick with dust and the droppings of desert creatures. But it was shelter. It was a place to stop running, if only for a night. That evening, they built a small, smokeless fire in the rusted-out shell of an old stove, the tiny flame a fragile beacon of warmth against the encroaching chill of the high desert night. They sat on opposite sides of the stove, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy with all the things they had not said, the weight of the past week, of the flight, of their shared and separate fears, finally became too much to bear. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice quiet and raspy from thirst and disuse. She was staring into the small, dancing flames, her face a stark relief of light and shadow. "After Elias and Thomas were killed," she began, her voice hollow, "I did not want to live anymore." The confession hung in the air, a raw and painful offering. Luke did not move, did not speak. He just listened, his attention absolute. I would go out to their graves every evening and just sit there. I thought about taking my husband's rifle. It would have been so easy. Just one moment of noise, and then silence. The kind of silence I craved. She paused, tracing a line in the dust on the floor with her finger. But then the sun would come up, and the cow would need milking. A fence post would be down. The weeds would be choking the vegetables. The ranch, it would not let me go. Every day, it gave me a reason to get out of bed, a task that needed doing, a problem that needed fixing. It demanded my sweat and my blood and my anger. It kept me anchored to the world when all I wanted to do was drift away. "It did not save me," she whispered, looking up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It just kept me here." She had never told anyone this, had barely allowed herself to think it. To speak it aloud to him was an act of ultimate trust, a bearing of the deepest, most broken part of her soul. She was showing him the ghost she carried, the woman who had stood on the edge of the abyss. Luke absorbed her confession, his expression softening with a profound, aching empathy. He understood now, the fierce, almost desperate way she had clung to that unforgiving piece of land. It was not just a home, it was the crucible that had forged her survival. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "I used to think," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "that things like love and peace, they were for other men. Men who had not done the things I have done. Men whose hands were clean." He looked down at their joined hands, at the stark contrast between his large, scarred hand and her smaller, equally work-worn one. A man who has killed, especially one who has killed his own blood. He walks a different path. You learn to live with the ghosts, but you do not ever expect the sun to shine on you again. You just learn to live in the shadows. He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and the sadness in his eyes was so deep it threatened to drown her. "And then I met you. You were living in your own shadow, but you were fighting it with everything you had. You were covered in dust and grief, but you burned brighter than anyone I had ever known. You made me think that maybe the sun could shine again, even for a man like me." His words were a confession to match her own, an admission of the hope she had unknowingly sparked in him. The walls of guilt and fear that had stood between them for days finally crumbled to dust. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by the ruins of other people's lives, they were just a man and a woman, stripped bare of everything but their shared pain and their desperate, fragile love for one another. He leaned forward, and she met him halfway. He drew her into his arms, and she went willingly. Burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, he held her tightly, as if he were afraid she might disappear. It was not a prelude to passion, but an act of profound solace. They were two survivors clinging to a life raft in a vast, dark ocean. He led her to his bedroll, spread out on the dusty floor. In the cold, quiet darkness of the abandoned shack, their intimacy was a silent, desperate prayer. It was a tender exploration of scars, both seen and unseen. It was a quiet affirmation of life in a place that smelled of death and decay. Every touch was both a question and an answer, a rediscovery of a language their bodies had long forgotten. It was shadowed by pain and haunted by their pasts. But for a few precious hours, they found a measure of grace in each other's arms, a fragile hope that they might one day build something new from the ruins. The sound that shattered their peace was distant at first, a faint popping noise that could have been a rock splitting in the cold. But then it came again, closer this time, sharp and unmistakable. Gunfire. They were instantly awake, their bodies tense. Luke was on his feet in a second, pulling on his boots, his gun belt in his hand. He moved to the broken-out window, peering into the pre-dawn gloom. "Get dressed," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. They had been found. The world had tracked them down to their last, desperate hiding place. "It is a posse," Luke said, his back still to her. "At least 3 riders, coming up the canyon." He turned to face her, his expression grim, but his eyes were clear and resolute. "You need to go. Now. There is a path at the back of the camp. It leads up into the high rocks. Take Bess. You can lose them up there. I will hold them off here. Lead them the other way." He was offering himself as a sacrifice. He was trying to save her, to atone for the trouble he had brought her. And Clara, who had spent her whole life declaring she did not need saving, felt a fierce, protective rage rise up in her. She finished buckling her own gun belt, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. She walked over to him, stood before him, and looked him square in the eye. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Clara, this is not a discussion. They are here for me. You can still get away." "And go where?" "Luke, back to a life that does not exist anymore, back to being alone." She reached up and placed her hands on his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart beneath her palms. "You once told me you did not want to save me. You asked only to love me." Her voice broke, but she forced the words out. "You said love ain't saving. Then do not rob me of loving you. Not now." His resolve wavered. He looked into her eyes and saw not a frightened woman he needed to protect, but a warrior, his equal, ready to stand with him at the end of the world. He saw the truth of her words. To send her away would be to deny the very love he had asked for. A bullet splintered the wood of the doorframe, and the decision was made. "Stay behind the stove," he yelled, pushing her toward the relative cover of the rusted metal. He took his position by the window, his rifle ready. Clara crouched behind the stove, pulling her own pistol, her hands slick with sweat. The shootout was a chaotic nightmare of noise and flashing light in the gray dawn. Bullets tore through the flimsy walls of the shack, sending splinters of wood flying. Luke returned fire with a calm, deadly efficiency, his shots measured and precise. He was no longer the gentle drifter. He was the soldier he had once been, a man who knew the grim calculus of battle. Clara fired when she could, aiming at the flashes of gunfire from the rocks outside. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but a fiercer emotion burned through it, a desperate, primal need to protect the man who was fighting for their lives. One of the riders let out a sharp cry and fell. The second rider, seeing his partner go down, began to retreat, firing wildly as he scrambled for cover. The third man, more determined, used the opportunity to charge the shack from the side. Luke saw him coming a second too late. He swung his rifle around, but the bounty hunter was already raising his pistol. There was a deafening roar as the man fired. Luke cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and stumbled backward, his body shielding Clara from the blast. He fired his own rifle as he fell, and the bounty hunter outside collapsed. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the noise. It was broken only by the ragged sound of Luke's breathing. "Luke!" Clara screamed. She scrambled to his side. He was slumped against the wall, his hand pressed to his side, blood seeping thick and dark between his fingers. "Go!" he gasped, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Clara, run!" But she was no longer listening. She hooked her arms under his and dragged him, his dead weight a terrible, straining burden, toward the back of the shack. She kicked open the splintered back door and pulled him out into the cold morning air, away from the sight of the dead men, her hands slippery with his blood, her heart breaking with every agonizing inch. She dragged him to the meager cover of a rock fall, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. She laid him down gently, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound. It was bad, high on his side, but bleeding too much. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale pink and gray. The world was waking up to a new day, indifferent to their small, desperate tragedy. Luke's eyes were glassy with pain, his breathing shallow. Clara leaned over him, her face close to his, her tears mingling with the blood and grime on her hands. The terror of losing him was a physical force, but she would not let it win. She had not come this far, had not risked everything, to lose him now. "You listen to me, Luke McKenna," she whispered, her voice a fierce, trembling thing in the quiet dawn. "You do not die on me. Not after all this." Her fierce command hung in the cold dawn air, a prayer and a promise. But the world did not listen to the prayers of fugitives. Luke's life was leaking out of him, a dark stain spreading on the unforgiving ground. Getting him on his horse was a nightmare of agonizing pain for him and Brute, desperate effort for her. Every jostle, every step, tore a groan from his lips, a sound that ripped at Clara's soul. They traveled for what felt like an eternity, moving slowly through a maze of canyons and forgotten trails, deeper into the wilderness, deeper into oblivion. She found it by accident, a miracle in a world that had run out of them. Tucked into a high, sheltered valley, almost completely hidden by a grove of ancient, gnarled junipers, stood the ruins of an old Spanish mission chapel. It was a skeleton of a place, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower a jagged stump against the sky. The roof was a lattice of missing tiles, but a large portion over the nave remained intact. Inside, it was a hollow, sacred space, filled with dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced the gloom. A few broken pews lay scattered like fallen soldiers, and at the front, a simple stone altar stood against the wall, solid and eternal. It was a place of ghosts, but they were peaceful ghosts. It was a sanctuary. Here, their world shrank to the size of 4 crumbling walls. Here, Clara began her long, desperate vigil. The weeks that followed blurred into a grueling cycle of survival. She became a creature of the wilderness, her grief and fear channeled into a fierce, protective instinct. She learned to read the tracks of rabbits and quail, hunting with a ruthless efficiency that would have shocked the woman she used to be. She found a small, spring-fed pool of clean water deep in the junipers. She discovered wild herbs with healing properties, yarrow to pack the wound and stop the bleeding, willow bark to boil into a bitter tea to fight the fever. She tended to Luke with a devotion that was a kind of prayer. She cleaned his wound, bathed his feverish body with cool water, and forced broth and tea between his cracked lips. For days, he hovered in a delirium, a shadowy space between life and death, muttering of battles and smoke and a brother named Samuel. In those long, terrifying nights, she would sit beside him, holding his hand, her voice a low, steady murmur as she told him stories of her ranch, of the way the sun set over the western plains, of the stubborn corn that refused to grow. She spoke of anything and everything, using her words as an anchor to keep him tethered to the world of the living. Slowly, miraculously, he began to mend. The fever broke, and the light of awareness returned to his eyes. As he healed, Winter crept into the high valley. The days grew short and sharp, the nights achingly cold. The first snows dusted the peaks above them, a beautiful, stark reminder of their isolation. They were trapped, cut off from the world, and in that isolation, they found a strange and profound peace. The world outside had indeed turned against them. A traveling fur trapper, a grizzled old man who stumbled upon their sanctuary by chance, shared a tattered month-old newspaper with them before moving on. The news was a death sentence. Her ranch, the land that had been her anchor, had been seized by the county in lieu of fines for aiding a fugitive. His name, Luke McKenna, was on a wanted poster, a bounty on his head for the killing of the men at the mining camp, branded an outlaw and a murderer. They had been officially erased, their lives and histories rewritten by the law. Clara expected the news to crush them, but it did the opposite. With nothing left to lose, with no life to return to, they were finally, completely free. All they had in the entire world was what existed within the crumbling walls of the chapel. All they had was each other, and it was enough. Their love, born in storms and forged in fire, now flourished in the quiet, snowbound stillness. Peace was found in the smallest, most ordinary things. It was the shared warmth of the fire they kept burning in a makeshift hearth against the altar. It was the taste of a rabbit stew she cooked, a meal that felt like a feast. It was the weak but genuine sound of his laughter as she recounted a story of her stubborn old mare, Bess. It was the comforting weight of his hand finding hers in the darkness as they lay on their bed of pine boughs and blankets, a silent reassurance that they were not alone. She would read to him from a tattered, water-stained Bible she found tucked away in a collapsed sacristy, its psalms of suffering and hope a fitting scripture for their small congregation of 2. He was still weak, his movements slow and pained, but his spirit was calm. The ghosts in his eyes had quieted, soothed by the gentle rhythm of their days. In this forgotten, holy place, the man who believed he deserved no peace had finally found it. But their sanctuary was a fragile one, their peace built on borrowed time, the wound in his side, which had seemed to be healing, never truly closed, without proper medicine. A deep and insidious infection had taken root, a rot that no amount of herbal tea or desperate prayer could cleanse. In the heart of winter, as the snows fell thick and heavy, the fever returned. This time, it was different. It was not the raging fire of delirium, but a slow, consuming ember that gradually stole his strength. He grew thinner, his face acquiring a pale, translucent quality. He knew and she knew, with a certainty that defied hope, that he was not going to survive the season. She fought it with a desperate, silent fury, continuing her rituals of care, refusing to acknowledge the truth her heart already understood. He was fading from her, a slow, gentle slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In his final days, his concern was only for her. His voice was a thin, reedy whisper, but his eyes were clear, filled with a fierce, protective love. "Clara," he said one afternoon, as she sat beside him, spooning a thin broth into his mouth. The light in the chapel was gray and soft, the world outside muffled by a fresh fall of snow. "You need to rest, Luke," she whispered, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "No," he insisted, his hand weakly finding hers. "You have to promise me something." He paused, gathering his strength. "When the spring thaw comes, you will go back. You will go back to the ranch." "There is no ranch," she said, her voice breaking. "They took it." "You will get it back," he said, a flicker of his old strength in his voice. "You will fight for it. That land, it is a part of you. It kept you here. You have to go back. You have to plant your crops. You have to live. Clara, promise me. Let me go knowing that you will keep living." He was trying to give her a reason to go on without him. He was trying to save her, one last time, from the despair he knew would come. She looked at him, at his beautiful, weary face, at the love that shone from him even as his life was guttering like a candle flame. And she could not bear it. She shook her head, tears finally tracing paths down her soot-stained cheeks. She set the bowl aside and gathered him into her arms, holding his frail body against hers. Snowflakes, fat and silent, had begun to drift down through the holes in the roof, melting on the stone floor like tears. "I was dead before you found me," she whispered, her face buried in his hair. "I was just a ghost, walking through the motions of being alive. You came, and you made me fight again. You made me feel again." She pulled back to look at him, her gaze fierce and unwavering. "You gave me breath again, Luke." A small, sad smile touched his lips. He raised a trembling hand to her cheek, his touch as light as a snowflake. He saw the truth in her eyes. In saving him, she had saved herself. In loving him, she had learned to live again. He died in her arms as the snow fell, his last breath a quiet sigh against her skin. His final words were a whisper, so soft she almost did not hear them. "Then I saved you after all." Months passed. The deep snows of winter melted under the warm gaze of a spring sun, feeding the dry creeks until they ran full and clear. The world turned green again, a vibrant, aching testament to the persistence of life. When the mountain passes were clear, Clara buried Luke on a high, sun-drenched ridge overlooking the valley, beneath a solitary, wind-scoured pine. She had no stone to mark his grave, so she built a small cairn of river rocks, a simple, sturdy monument to a simple, sturdy man. Then she went home. The fight for her ranch was not easy, but she was no longer the woman who endured things silently. She was a woman forged in fire and loss, and she had a promise to keep. She rode into Dry Creek, not with defiance, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity. The townsfolk who saw her were taken aback. The scorn and suspicion were gone from their eyes, replaced by a kind of awe, a grudging and quiet respect for a woman who had walked through hell and returned, not broken, but whole. With the help of the circuit judge, an old, fair-minded man who was more interested in justice than in gossip. She proved that the ranch had been seized on false pretenses. She got it back. She worked the land with a singular focus, her grief a fuel that burned clean and hot. She cleared the blackened, scorched earth where the fire had passed, her hands tilling the soil, turning the ash of the past into the promise of the future. She planted new crops, and in the rich, dark earth, they grew. She placed his grave on the small rise behind the cabin, beneath the lone cottonwood tree where she had once thought to be buried herself. It was a peaceful spot, with a view of the entire valley. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the land, she walked up to his grave. The new corn was knee-high in the fields, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood. She knelt and placed a single, purple wildflower on the mound of earth. "You did not save me, Luke," she murmured to the quiet stone and the whispering wind. "You loved me, and that was enough." She stood, her face turned toward the magnificent, bleeding colors of the sunset. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair, whipping it across her face, a profound peace, one she had never known, settled into her soul. She was alone, but she was not empty. She carried her ghosts, but they no longer haunted her. They were a part of her, woven into the fabric of the strong, resilient woman she had become. She had learned the hardest and most beautiful lesson the West had to teach, that love was not a weakness to be feared, but a strength to be wielded, the only kind of courage that truly endures. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.